All right, so like I think I'm Sisco, and I really appreciate you guys coming to this. Battle history is in class. We'll see how this goes. I don't know how many of you guys know me. I am kind of a military geek by nature. I've spent basically since I was 17 in some version or not of being in the military. I'm now 43, so it's 26. And this was one of the things that I've always found interesting in my faith, is trying to understand what God's trying to say to me in certain parts of the Bible that I would just normally plow through. Especially when you're doing you read through the Bible and your thing, and you get to like, Genesis has some cool stories, Exodus like that, Exodus is cool, but then you're in this weird place, this weird name, this weird place, this weird name, you have all these weird guys with weird names. You didn't hear that before, but I thought those guys were dead, and they got these guys again. And then after they try to do it all over again because they did the wrong thing in the desert, whatever. So, one of the things that I've tried to take on my own in my study is to see what God's trying to tell me through those different aspects of the Bible. Because every Bible story is there for a reason. We all want to. There's always a place for us to grab what God is trying to tell us in our own walk. So the lead into all that being said is that you're going to see things today that you might just be like, dude, boring. Moving on, thanks. And that's great. This is not a sermon. It's not meant to be a sermon. I'm hoping to basically facilitate a discussion where I throw some things up there that I think are interesting. And I very much appreciate the opportunity of you guys asking questions. You're going to see some maps, you're going to see some pictures, you're going to see a little bit of stuff that you pull from extra biblical sources. But the one thing I do want to say is that I do come at this from a place of biblical inerrancy, right? So at no point am I going to say like, yeah, well, the Bible says this, but actually this archaeologist dude says this and he's probably right. This is not the apologetics session. I'm not the guy that's going to be doing that for you, but what I hope to be able to show you is that there are aspects of this from the military side that make God even more interesting as you're trying to understand what he's doing for us. Any questions before we start? Alrighty then. So just really quickly, I should have put this on the main page, but the Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. Like, there are many ways of looking at God and who he is, and there are many ways of looking at what the Bible stories tell us and what our redemption tells us. And Pastor Mark and Pastor Lou are great about telling some of the softer side of things, but every once in a while, like, the Lord just has to lay it down. And so we're going to talk about a few of those things. So this is basically the Middle East in about 2000 BC. Over here, you've got the country of Elam, and I cut it off on my red PowerPoint. You've got Sumer right here, you've got Babylon right here, you've got Assyria up here. These were the major powers in the Middle East in about 2000 BC, right? The Tigris River here, the Euphrates River up here, made this whole region here a really fertile valley, Mesopotamia, which you probably heard from memory in high school or college or whatever. But a really fertile valley, and allowed people to get really large quantities of populace. They were able to feed their people, keep them strong, and utilize that ability to set up civilization to make a professional warrior class, or to make a professional religious class, or to make a professional academic class. So down here is where Ur of the Chaldeans is. You guys may have heard of that because that's where Abram comes from, and we'll be talking about him for just a second. So, like I said, over here is where kind of a lot of cool civilization stuff is going on. Down over here is Egypt. There's some interesting civilization stuff going on there. At about 2000 BC, depending on which chronology you look at, they're either starting up the intermediate kingdoms or they're finishing up the old kingdom aspect of it, part of the first three. So there's huge amounts of irrigation projects going up and down the 700 miles of the Nile River at that point. And it floods for 3 months every year, so which means that for 9 months of the year, the Egyptians basically farm the soil, and for 3 months when it floods, they have all these millions of people, about 69 million depending on what year you were in about that time, but 69 million people have nothing to do for 3 months except work on like construction projects and the stuff that we would do like back in the Great Depression. Hey, we have a whole bunch of people out of work, let's build a dam here. That's cool. Let's build a pyramid, that'll be fun. Let's set up a whole bunch of new temple worship sites, that'll be cool. So, you got a major area here, major civilization area here, and the only place in all of this that has like almost any sustainability for any level of agriculture, farming, resources, whatever, is right along the strip of ocean here, about 50 miles wide at its widest, and 50 miles long, and about 15 miles wide. And that coastal plain has been called Canaan for basically ever. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about. So Abram, about 2000 BC, again, depending on how you do your chronologies and things like that, it could be plus or minus a couple hundred years. But roughly about 2000 BC, Abram gets called from Ur of the Chaldeans. Again, really big place, high civilization. Like this would be like the New York City of the time type thing, right? So he's taken up here and he's called to go to Canaan. I'm not going to get into why he was called or what that meant or all those kind of things. But as I said before, there's a road here, but you don't want to go straight across. Like there's nothing on the way, no rest stops, no Tesla supercharger or anything like that. So basically, Abram makes his way up from Ur of the Chaldeans, goes up here through Babylon, through Assyria, and he goes to a place called Haran. And then, by the way, Nineveh right here got destroyed so badly, we'll know that later on, that when the Greeks marched by about 500 years later, they didn't even realize they were on past one of the biggest cities the world ever seen, because it was already torn so much to the ground. And then spends some time up there in Haran, and then comes back down here through Canaan, and we'll get to that in just a second. Here's a better shot of it. As he's coming down the coast, in Haran, he gets the call from the Lord that basically says, go leave land of your birth, go to this place I'm going to give for you, which Canaan. And as he goes there, there's a famine there, and they're like, great, you sent me to a place where there's a famine. Now what am I going to do? So as he heard that, hey, the next big civilization thing is over here, let's go down to Egypt and see what's going on. A quick story, you guys have probably heard it. Abram walks in with his wife Sarah. She's, a beautiful young lady. He walks in, the Pharaoh's like, hey, your wife's pretty high. He's like, hey, you saw my wife, she's my sister. And the Pharaoh's like, sweet, let me bring her in. And of course, like, everybody gets venereal diseases and all kinds of stuff. And they go, Abram, what are you talking about? Like, I thought you said she was your sister, not your wife. It's like, well, I mean, technically she kind of is like the daughter of my father, but through my uncle's left side of and they're like, dude, just get out of here. So he goes back out. So Abram had been to Egypt, sojourned there for a bit during the famine, and then goes back. So, a few years go by. Remember I said that a bunch of these guys over here, really powerful dudes, high civilization, there's like 4, better. Oh, higher. Thank you. So we got 4 civilizations up here in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Sumerians, the Elamites. You've heard of all those guys, they're all powerful at the time. And they're like, check it out. We're kind of bored with what we're doing here. We're going to go over because we hear there's some stuff over here. Remember, all this is just boring nothingness. North Saudi Arabia, a whole bunch of desert. But over here, you guys have land, you have resources and riches, and you're right next to Egypt, so you can trade with them, so you got even more Egyptian stuff too. So how about we just roll and take it over? So the 4 kings of these 4 areas, one of them you might have heard of called Hammurabi, rolls down here and decides that they're going to attack right here at the bottom of what now is called the Dead Sea, but at the time it's called the Salt Sea, because it wasn't all the way dead yet. Remember, 4,000 years ago. And then you go down to a place here where the E in Beersheba is. So again, kings of all this area over here, super high civilization, taking on the 5 kings of this area, but E in Beersheba. So of course they show up at the battlefield, and similar to how you guys might have seen in Braveheart, where the big army shows up, the little army shows up, and they go out to the parlay, and they're like, hey guys, we're not going to fight this today, right? No, as long as you surrender us, we don't have to fight. Like, cool beans, we surrender. So they surrender, and the 4 kings of the east come over and take over the land. They put in some garrisons, they take a bunch of resources, take some slaves back for what they're going to do. And 14 years later, the kings down here, Sodom, Gomorrah, Zuzim, Enim, Horter, Rephaim, they decide, you know what, we're gonna rise up now. And so at this point, the 4 kings come back. They haven't gotten less powerful in the last 14 years. And so they come back, and as you see, these 4 come here from Elam, Samaria, from Syria, from Rome. They come down, and they meet up here where the kings of the Southern Kingdom are at. And they crush those dudes. And they go through all the way down to what's now the top of the Red Sea, and they crush all those guys. And then they come all the way back up here to a place called Kadesh. That'll be important later on. But here in Kadesh, they meet all those guys, and in a place there, one more thing, they come back up here at the bottom of the Salt Sea. Again, used to be Salt Sea, now it's the Dead Sea. At the time, it wasn't even a Salt Sea, it was a valley. And it was a valley that you might have heard of with Sodom and Gomorrah, where there's a bunch of slime pits. They call them bitumen pits or sinkholes or whatever. But it really wasn't the greatest ground. So when the 5 kings have decided to rise up, stand up here, and get attacked by this huge army of the 4 kings of the east, they just run away, and 3 of the kings fall into slime pits. Once their kings are gone, the soldiers are like, why am I playing around anymore? The kings are dead, I don't want to do anything. So they kind of surrender, and as what normally happens during the battlefield for this time, if you surrender, if you get routed, you get to take the men and the women and the children and the cattle and the sheep and the gold and all that, not necessarily in all that order, and you get to take it with you. Well, one of the dudes who happened to be caught up right here in this battle, at the bottom of the Salt Sea, now the Dead Sea, used to be a slime pit, was a guy called Lot. Lot just happened to be Abram's nephew, right? So he gets taken up with all these slaves and men, women, children, cattle, booty, all that kind of stuff. And the 4 kings of the east are going to go north and they're going to go home. And as they go out to the coastal plain, and they try to get the major cities that they have here to try to sell some slaves, get some grain, maybe do some trading, whatever. So Abram's here, kind of West Canaan, and he hears that his nephew just got taken. So remember, you have armies, thousands of guys strong, coming up here. They just crushed 4 or 5 different groups of armies, including the confederations of 5 southern kings of Canaan, and they're on their way back home. Abram goes, I can't let my nephew go out like that. So he basically takes 318 of his guys, arms them up in a way that you'll see pretty quickly, arms them up in light infantry, and they basically run through the mountains here, off the main roads. They catch up to where the army is going along its way, and Abram, with 318 guys, ambushes in 3 different parts a 5,000-man army, wipes them out. Takes all the booty they had, all the men, women, children, cattle, goats, sheep, gold, silver, and sends it back in. By the way, Lot's in that now, so he's happy, right? And so what happened next though is that Abram, remember, he's just a visitor here. God's told him this is going to be his land someday, but it's not his land yet. So in this valley, he finds a guy named Melchizedek. Melchizedek's the king. He's also the high priest. And he's the high priest of this kind of monotheistic religion that follows this God that we're not really sure at the time what it is. But Abram goes, I appreciate it, man, thank you. As an offering for me going through your land, which just happened to be a town called Salem, turns out to be called Jerusalem someday. He offers him all the booty except for what Lot had and what he took. And so Melchizedek said, no thanks, I just need a tithe of this, and I'm going to go sacrifice it to my God. And so Abram, Melchizedek, and that kind of led into a whole bunch of other theological stuff that I'm not going to go into today, but you've probably heard a sermon or 2 on in your lifetime. But anyway, that was the Battle of Siddim. Brought the bread and wine and blessed them. And then, interestingly enough, turns out there's nothing new under the sun, right? So this valley of Siddim, where the ambush had occurred in the bottom of the Salt Sea in roughly 2000 BC, in 1918, the 4th Australian Mounted Division destroyed the Turkish 4th Army Infantry in retreat right around here, doing basically the same thing that Abram did, which was do the light fighting up in the hills and ambush them when they congregated in one spot. Don't be a big heavy army going through the hills when you're getting ambushed, I guess is the military takeaway from that. So at that point, Abram makes his way to Egypt again, and there's another couple hundred years of stuff that goes on. I want to stop there for a second. Any questions about any of the stuff we just walked through? Okay. So fast forward a couple hundred years, 430 if you believe the Bible. And this is kind of what the ancient Near East looked like in about 1200 BC. Again, this is a little bit off. This is a map that I found that I just wanted to steal since I didn't want to put my own together. But you have some major kingdoms. So at this point, the Cretan and Minoan civilization had been going on for a while. You might have heard of them also called sometimes the Sea Peoples. You might also hear them called, spoiler alert, the Philistines. We'll get to that in just a minute. Actually, that's 60. But you had, a Grecian civilization up here that was going on. You had here a civilization called the Hittites, probably heard of them. Egypt down here, and then this is the land of Canaan we'll be talking about, right? So if you notice, Egypt had taken the mantle of owning this area up here, and they had garrisons all throughout those cities that you see there, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Biblos, Kadesh, Tyre, all the way up. And basically, we'll be getting to it later on, but as we go forward in the class, you'll see that a lot of the infighting came because these guys are coming down, these guys are coming over, these guys are coming out there, a few guys coming from the east, and really the one kind of, roadblock in the way is this little area called Canaan, 50 miles wide, 200 miles long, not really that great. All right, so I'm going to talk about the Exodus. So everyone's read the stories, everyone's watched Prince of Egypt, everyone knows that, all the stuff that Moses did, all the plagues, all that kind of stuff. But I want to actually take a look at this from again, from the military standpoint and move a little bit away from the theological side. So there's a lot of Egyptian archaeological finding and things like that, and there's a lot of work that's gone on to talk about the concept of the Habaru. And the Habaru is what some people say are turned into Hebrew and what the Israelites call themselves. But it wasn't slave. That wasn't the translation they would use on that. We'll get to why they kind of revolted in a second. But the concept of the Habaru was that there were these nomadic peoples that were coming from over here for a few hundred years beforehand. But they weren't nomads. They weren't like Bedouins like we might think today, where I've got a few camels, I pack up my stuff, I go from tent to tent, oasis to oasis, don't do anything like that. This was much more on the term of a rabble-rouser, or a marauder, or riffraff, or mean strangers, or something like that, right? So one of the hypotheses that happened was that after Joseph came down and did his thing at the end of Genesis and basically saved Egypt and all civilization because of getting the 7 years of grain, with plenty, holding it so he's going to give it out in the 7 years of famine, becoming high up into the Pharaoh's kingdom, and basically allowing his whole family to come down and settle in Egypt in this area called Goshen, because Goshen was right here at the top. You guys probably see how the Nile River comes up and then kind of spreads out like a big fan right up near the Nile Delta. So Goshen was the far eastern part of the Delta, and it was a place where you couldn't really do a lot of building because there was a lot of grasslands. So it was great, and they could grow some grain up there, but it was right up against some swamps and marshes and things. And it was also a place where there wasn't a whole lot of civilization going on because most of it was down here. Memphis was the capital, Amarna was a big city, had been the capital for a while, and then it was farther on down the Nile that the major civilization centers of Egypt were. So Joseph and his family were given the name Goshen up here, and that's where they think a lot of the affiliated Habaru started to come in over the next few hundred years, right? And again, not necessarily as slaves, but as almost in a military manner, almost as mercenaries, right? So if you recall, when we went back up the slides. Oops. So if you recall, there's one major road that goes from Egypt to all this area over here where people go. This is it's called the way of the pharaohs, for a while. It ends up being called the Via Maris when the Romans are there because it's the way of the Roman, or the way near the sea. And then it's been there and it's still there. Now it's Highway 5055 down here in Egypt, and then it goes up the coast, and it's kind of like the I-95 of the day. It's like George Washington and his super great grandparents had used it to fight the revolution and stuff. Meanwhile, this road here is called King's Highway, and that'll come into account later on. It was where if you didn't want to mess with going down the coast here because they weren't your people, or the Egyptians had control of the fortresses, you don't want to pay the taxes, whatever the case may be, you skirted the edge of this really dry, hot, dusty desert, go down to a place where it's kind of mountainy and flat, mountainy and plateauy, and high and hot and dangerous, but you could relieve yourself from going through all of this stuff along the coastline. So they call it King's Highway. But if you look, if this is the main road coming in, anybody from anywhere over here, remember the Hittites were coming in here, the Greeks were coming in, laying in here on the coastal plain, all these guys from over here were getting ready to come down. There's one road that comes into Egypt right there. So, when these Habaru, when these kind of mercenary type guys, these marauders, these guys who are strong enough to handle their own business, when we're going to give them some land, we'll give them the land up here, right along that roadway, and say, you guys got this if you can defend this. And so, for a few hundred years, or 30 years, if this is the Bible, there was a group of marauders or Habaru or people up here who were family of Joseph, close friends of Joseph, people who came in because they had the same lifestyle of Joseph and his family, and settled up here. And the way of the Habaru was, again, in other extra biblical texts, talking about how they were, up in the rest of the kingdom, as long as things were going well, they stayed in the same place. When things started getting messy, they either took stuff in their own hands or they left and went to a better place and took stuff in their own hands. So for hundreds of years, they're doing fine in Egypt. Up to a point where, again, if you remember the Bible story, the Pharaoh that took in Moses had basically just completed a huge cleansing of the Egyptian religion. He had wanted to go over to a monotheistic realm. And so, again, reading some of the extra biblical Egyptian sources, the Pharaoh of Moses, the Pharaoh that kind of took Moses in and started Moses in, had just used the Habaru, who were kind of the marauding, awesome mercenary guys, and basically said, hey guys, you do that whole one religion thing too, right? Well, so do I. How cool is that? I'm not going to have my guys who've been worshiping Amun-Ra and Osiris and all those guys for the last few hundred years start tearing down temples. I'll get revolts and riots. How about you guys? Help me out here. And so they were kind of the crew that during the 3 months when they aren't, farming or taking their goats out or something like that, they're like, hey, if instead of just sitting around doing nothing, I can go tear down temples to Osiris and start building up the stuff that you want us to do. Hey, that's cool. So some of the extra biblical sources say they did. But when the bad Pharaoh came in, he basically said, cool guys, you are now going to rebuild everything you just did. So it wasn't necessarily that they were slaves. They were conscripted hard labor, and they were going to do a job that nobody wanted to do, and they got stuck with it. If you read, again, some of the different translations of Exodus, you'll see that it's not necessarily the word slave, but it's forced labor, induced labor, things like that. And so one of the, again, extra biblical sources would say is that the marauders, the guys who've been there for 400 years, liking what they did, doing great, being these mercenaries, these awesome kind of marauder type guys, doing some of the dirty work for the Pharaoh, maybe doing some of the religious work of getting some of the people turned into what the monotheistic religion should be. All of a sudden, they're like, not only are you going to not do what you want to do, you're going to do what I want you to do. I'm not going to pay you for it. And oh, by the way, it's going to be rebuilding these temples to Osiris and Amun-Ra and all that stuff that you took down later. You're welcome. So that's where the concept of even the extra biblical parts of the Exodus came about. Why is that important? Why is it important from a military perspective? Because remember, for the rest of the class tonight and going on forward, these guys weren't slaves like you might think of, slaves in 1840 in Alabama, where they weren't allowed to pick up a stick, they weren't allowed to have weapons, they weren't allowed to do training on things other than just the one thing they could do. They had civilization kind of their own. They had their own shopkeepers, they had their own metalsmiths, they had their own wagon makers, they had their own shield makers, they had their own whole industry that could keep them in this kind of mercenary position, at least some part of them, so that when they took the Exodus, it wasn't just a bunch of people who'd never picked up a sword in their life walking out there. It was a group of marauders saying, we're going to go make our own way now. So keep that in mind as we go forward on this. The last thing I'll say going about this part is, as you're reading through Exodus, as you're reading through these things, again, I don't want to get into the theological side today. It works just as well if every time it says God in there or the Lord or Yahweh, if you take that to mean the omniscient and perfect general, like the Napoleon if he knew everything, the Caesar if he was God. Think of it kind of naturally, because there's some really, really cool things that occur that a commander would set up that you don't really think of God as a general really in. But some of the things that he commands Moses to do, you're like, that's tactically brilliant. No, Brian, he's God, he knows what he's doing, right? But if you look at it from that perspective, you'll see a lot cooler stuff come out of it in the military perspective. All right, so we talked about armament. So here are some relics that the Israelites would have had as they were on their exodus, right? So they had these short swords, we had the dirks, but the thing that they actually had was a thing called the kopesh. Some of it, it's called like the foreleg or something like that. This was a very, very, if not Egyptian in origin weapon, it was used a ton by the Egyptians, and the Israelites, as they would have been working with them and seeing their military and things like that, would have started using it. And you can see it's kind of a curved, kind of sickle-looking thing with a big stick on the end of it. The slice side is actually the inner part, the curve here. So you could blunt force trauma somebody with the outside, and then use the inside of the sickle to slice it. The interesting thing about that is that the kopesh here was the favored weapon of the light infantry. Like you might think of like Troy, they got spears, and the Romans got their swords, and the Egyptians had their chariots and things. Well, the light infantry of the Israelites and the marauders, if we call them that, had this kopesh. What that meant is that when they're running around up and down hills through places where there's not a whole lot of water, there's a whole bunch of rocks, whatever, they're not running 70 pounds of armor, carrying 3 huge spears with 2 swords and a dagger on their side. They've got this kopesh that is actually just as lethal in kind of the up close and personal fighting, but they're way more agile and they're way more maneuverable in what they're trying to do than a heavily armed soldier or a chariot or something like that. All right, so maps. We've already talked about how Goshen is right here in this area. And we said that this road here, the way of the Pharaohs, is the one main road that goes back up here. You can actually, you don't have to be like a geospatial expert to understand. Dark colors are like mountainy stuff. Light colors are like flat and coastline area. Oops. So all this area here in Goshen, where they're tending their sheep and cattle and things like that, they're doing great. And there's kind of one way that goes out, and it would be a nice flat road that thousands and thousands of people could go on. You could take men, women, and children, and goats and sheep and all that kind of stuff. And basically God said, I'm not going to let you go that way, guys. Because the Egyptians have fortresses every few miles on the way here. And all it's going to take is one time the Pharaoh changes his mind. And thinking through the story, I think he changed his mind a few times. But all it takes is one time the Pharaoh changes his mind, and we're sitting ducks on a plane with all our men, women, and children against trained charioteers, squadrons, like up to 150 chariots at a time, coming down out of the fortresses on top of us in the middle of a flat road. We're smoked. So we're going to go down this way. And we're going to go to a place called Sisco. Now, this is where I'm going to be totally upfront frank with you. A lot of this is still kind of up for debate. Even dudes that are military scholars, archaeologists, whatever, are like, well, it might have been here that they crossed the Red Sea, and maybe here, maybe not the Sea of Reeds, but it might have been the Red Sea. I think that based on how you read Exodus, that there are some cool things you can bring up. So the first one is that one day's march brought him to Sisco. So if you figure they're here in Goshen area, it's about 10 miles to get down to this area here, where they just basically got out of the city, got out of the Pharaoh's way, and they were on their way, took their stuff with them and went. There's an interesting aspect of this, though. If you read Exodus, I encourage you to read through it again. It's always fun to read Exodus, but I encourage you to read it again. You'll see the actual words that are being used. I'm totally delving into like Pastor Mark. I spent 12 years in seminary learning 8 different languages type thing here. But the way that the Hebrew says that they left was not they took their things and went. It basically is the word for getting girded up for battle. And it wasn't, I took my baskets and I packed up my kids and I got my clothes. It was, I girded myself up for battle. Which again, if you think, dude, these guys are slaves, what kind of stuff do they have getting ready for battle? It might kind of mess with your head. If you take a look at them as they're these generations of marauders and people who are getting forced out of the place that they've been for the last 400 years, basically you can get this picture of, all right, kind of the Mel Gibson from The Patriot, where he goes and he opens up his chest and he pulls out his rifle and he pulls out his war axe and everything, and you're like, oh man, this is about to go down. That's how you might want to think about the exit, right? So they girded themselves up for battle, but it even says they didn't even have time to bake. Like they had some unleavened bread, and they left almost all they had there, but they girded themselves up for battle. So the first day, they went about 10 miles, and they went to this place called Sisco. And here is where, on the way, that was where, if you remember the story, the Egyptian people were basically like, you just get out of here, we don't want you anymore, go. That might be a slight fancification, because again, if you look at some of the Hebrew, it's actually like they were kind of coercing the Egyptians on their way out, like, hey man, if you really want us to go, like, you might want to throw in a couple bucks here and there. And so when you read about what they did in Sinai, they didn't have a whole lot of food, they didn't have a lot of blankets, they didn't have a lot of clothes, but they had so much gold and silver that they all gave to Moses, gave to the priest to make a golden calf, and they're like, dude, I don't need all this here, I have something back. So anyway, the Israelites got to suck off at the end of the first day. Second day, it says, they woke up, and the Lord says, we're going to do a night march today. And he went before them at a pillar of fire to give them light. So, the interesting thing might be, this is the first time you heard it, like, okay, so that's cool, there's a miracle, there's this big pillar of fire in front of them or whatever. It's actually like a really genius military signal. So whenever the armies would go out, whether it was the Egyptian army, the Hittites army, the Babylonians, they would have to have signals. Nobody had radios, nobody had cell phones, nobody had ways to they didn't have like semaphore flags at the time, like B-A-A. They had smoke and they had fire. And the way that the commander of the army would show that they're stopping for the night was with this, basically setting up a fire and hoisting up a big brazier, on the end of a spear, say, look guys, we're all going to stop here, and the guys will all set up their camp around and go from there. This comes out to be really, really cool, because the Egyptians knew what fire and smoke meant. So the next day, they made this place called Pi-Hahiroth, in the Bible says between Migdol and the sea. So Migdol is not actually a place, like I capitalized it there because it's capitalized. It's actually kind of a lowercase m, and it means tower or fortress, right? So if you go back, we had said that they didn't want to go by the main road because there's fortresses all along here. Well, it turns out that right down here too, there's a couple of fortresses. And what God tells them is, don't try to skirt around the edge of the fortress and go down here into the rest of Egypt. We don't want to go there. Don't go back up here, because they'll get us to go back up there. I want you to park right about here. I want you to park, well again, this is my hypothesis, this is my reading situation. We want you to park between one of the fortresses and the ocean. And they were like, I'm sorry, what? And it was like, nope, we're parking here for the night. Guys, stop right here. And he sets the pillar of fire right there on top of it. And what that means to all the Pharaoh's guys that are coming in behind him now are, hey, they just set up their fire. They're camping out for the night. So the Egyptians, they've got their chariots, they've got their infantrymen, they've got all their guys, they've got the horsemen. They're like, hey, so we know that by setting up the fire up there, they're camping out for the night, so we can set up our camp for the night. And at the time, they thought, we'll get them in the morning. Like, we'll wake up, get them in the morning when we're all fresh and have our breakfast and stuff like that. They're not going anywhere. Well, it turns out, and we've got a couple of Army guys here, a couple of Marines, one of the hardest tactical maneuvers from anything from like a squad of 9 guys to like a division of 20,000 guys is a water movement at night. There are so many things that can go wrong with it that even like Rangers and Special Forces guys don't really want to mess with it if they don't have to. What God had planned for them, what the Supreme General, the Omniscient General had planned for them was, we're going to suck the Egyptians in, get them thinking that they're doing all right for themselves, and we're going to make a water crossing at night. So you might be thinking, okay, we've got a few thousand of these like marauder guys, but we've got a whole bunch of men, women, children, goats, sheep, whatever, that don't know how to do a tactical night crossing at night, even if they were awesome marauder guys. So what are we going to do here? And it goes back into, again, this gets into a little bit of apologetics. Some people say one thing, some people say there's another. But this area here, this is why I kind of like to think that it's in this area rather than some of the other places. Remember I told you that Goshen was where all the Nile, the eastern part of where all the Nile Delta started. So there's tons and tons of water coming in from the Nile River up into this Delta area. Think if you guys been down in New Orleans or southern Louisiana or something like that. Whole bunch of water, stuff swamped over all the time. But you've also got the big Red Sea right here. And the Red Sea is tidal. So every 12 hours you have high tide, every 12 hours you have a low tide, all those types of things. You also have this whole area right here is basically a funnel, the hot winds coming out from the east and meeting up with this kind of, massive cooler air along the river valley. Right? Some people, you might know this term, it's called the Sirocco. The Sirocco comes down out of the east. And it just so happens that there may have been this crazy, miraculous convergence of things happening that God knew was going to happen. So we had to park there that day, that night, getting ready to move that night. And when there was potentially like a low tide, swamp went down a little bit, salt water moves out, Sirocco comes in, dries up some of the stuff, but it gets dry enough that God's like, all right guys, I cleared the way for you, let's roll. So they pack up everything they do, and they march across the Sea of Reeds, Red Sea, however you want to say it. They march across, and Pharaoh wakes up in the morning. He's like, all right guys, we're about to go do this, and he sees that the entire Israelite camp is gone on the other side of the river. And this is where, again, it goes back to the Bible story. Pharaoh's not stoked about this, and Pharaoh decides, we're gonna go get these guys right now. We can't wait another day for me to get to the other side. We're gonna get these guys right now. His general's like, sir, how about you let us run the tactical situation? This is not really the greatest place. We can do things a little differently. We've got chariots and horses. They've got men, women, children, and ghosts, so we can catch up with them. And he goes, nope, we're gonna go do this. And so they try to go across, and you guys have heard the story. The wind picks up, the waves come back in, high tide happens, guys get stuck in the mud, get drowned, and now all these guys are over here on this side of the water, and no one chases them anymore. Hooray! Great for us. God is great all the time. And then they moved out here to the Sinai. So, by the way, this is about what the Pharaoh's chariot would look like. So again, men armed with that kopesh, not much more, women, children, goats, sheep, wagons maybe, going up against 600 or 1,000 of these chariot guys on the plain. Wasn't even good for them, but that's how it was. So, now we get to Sinai. So I showed you before, not only is the dark that it gets really high in the mountains, dark in the states also gets really hot. So in this hot, dry, dusty place that I'm sure I've got a picture of somewhere, we'll get to it soon. Hot, dry, dusty place, they're hanging out for one person. And they move the exact places aren't well known, but one of the great hypotheses that I kind of go is they kind of made their way around Sinai, went through over here it's called the Desert of Sin, or the Desert of Zin, you may have seen it called. And it wasn't necessarily because everyone sins when they go there, it's just that it was really hot and miserable, and that's what they called Zin. It was hot and miserable. And then, we'll get there in just a second. So, they camp out Sinai for a couple of months. This is where, God goes up Mount Sinai, God goes to Mount Sinai, speaks to Moses, 10 Commandments, all that kind of stuff, golden calf, all the cool stuff in the last half of Exodus that didn't turn out to be all that cool for the Israelites, and even the tabernacle. So, the tabernacle, interestingly enough, like you may be reading this as you're going through, if you're like me, and you're like, look, I don't care why was it dyed purple? Like, why was it 400 cubits by 12 cubits by, I don't even know what a cubit is. What is all this? Well, if you take a step back, this setting right here, God had them built it to look just like the Egyptian battle tents that they were used to for when they would go out into battle with the Pharaoh. Even to the point of having an opening pointed out towards the east. And he wanted to be such that they were, Brian's hypothesis, that the main battle tent, the place where the generals would go in and converse with God, where the Ark of the Covenant would be, was set up in a manner that it would be as if when the Egyptians would go in, they would go talk to their God, the Pharaoh, or things like that. But God had it set up this way because he wanted them to be strictly obedient to whatever he wanted, but that would be something they kind of had an idea of what it was going to be looking like at the end of it, right? So, even the tabernacle. And you can look at Numbers 10 to read up more about that. But the other really cool thing that happened at Sinai was that they started to set themselves up for what they were about to do and take over Canaan. So, you see here, this is, it's hard to read, sorry about that. I'll try to put that into a pamphlet for next time. But basically, they set up the Israelite battle, the order of march, right? So as I said, you had some guys, Issachar, they're really good at being scouts. The guys that can go forward ahead, pick out intel, move around, stay away from the bad guys, get information, bring it back. Then you had these, the Judah division, where you had your light light infantry and the elite heavy infantry of Zebulun and the heavy infantry of Judah. Following that, you have the clans of the Levites that would carry out the tabernacle stuff, including the Ark of the Covenant. And then you have the Gadites and Simeon, who had some light infantry divisions. And then you had a difference. You had basically the low-end version of the artillery at the time, right? So protected by, again, just like it would be a Braveheart or an Agincourt or something like that, you had your archers and you had your slingers. Big difference. Archers had, and the Israelites would think at the time had the compound bow, so they had basically the best bow of everyone they were going to go up against, and they'd been using it for hundreds of years. And you had slingers. And a lot of times, I was going through this for a long time. When I would hear the story like, David and Goliath, I was like, okay, this little kid gets a couple of things that would skip across the pond or something like that, put it in a sling and just happen to get it right into his forehead. These things, this is a picture from the Akkadian steel that was talking about how the Akkadians did it about 100 years later. But this thing up here is the size of a baseball, and it's either bronze or iron. And they're able to whip these things around and sling them at speeds that would take guys' heads off, right? So when you say that the slingers are there, it's not just, okay, yeah, some guys with slings, I guess they couldn't really pick up a spear, use a sword, so give them a sling, right? But this is the heavy artillery of the 1500 BC time frame, right? And then you had so archers, the artillery, and they were set up with more heavy infantry guarding the rear division. So why do I bring all that up? Because the next thing that happened was they were on their way up. They spent some time at Sinai, and they're like, okay, now we're ready, we're going to go up, and we're going to attack Canaan and take over the promised land and God promised us. And the Battle of Rephidim. By a show of hands, does anyone know what the Battle of Rephidim is, just off the top of your head? All right. If I said that it was the one where Moses had to have his hands held up because when his hands were up, they would win the battle, and I was getting some nods now, okay, good. So yeah, this is a battle where they'd been rolling around the desert for, again, a couple of months, and even if you say that it was a tribe that was used to being nomads, and they were used to take care of their goats and sheep and cattle and all that, and they were used to finding oases in the desert, 2 months is a long time to take hundreds of thousands of people out and keep them rolling around the desert. So this is where they did, outside Jabal Machlah. If you go back, it was on this side over here of the map. They actually have a rock that looks a lot like that. It's about 50 feet tall, and it's on a hill that's about 150 feet tall. And so a lot of people, whether they're Bible scholars or archaeologists or whatever, geologists are like, it'd be kind of weird. I'm not really sure. You'd have to have a weird way of setting that up to where you would have a frost expansion, but only in one plane, and then water would have to come through very quickly after that, and it would have to be water at a high speed with a high volume, but then go away quickly, or else it burn through all of it. And they're like, or it's like the miracle of God, pouring rock out of or water out of a rock, Moses able to stick. Could be that too. So they just got out of the water. They've been grumbling for a while. They do that a lot. Remember the marauders and riffraff, not necessarily great godly people. As they're walking around, these guys, the Amalekites, come up behind them. And I say come behind them because the Amalekites didn't come up, set up their camp, send out their champions, set up their battle lines, prepare for battle. What they did was, remember I said that Asher and Naphtali and Dan were the rear guard here? Well, they were the rear guard of the army guys. They weren't the rear guard of all the men, women, children, goats, cattle, sheep. So all the old sick land malays, is what we called it in the Marines, right? But all the people who were going slow or whatever, they got set upon by these Amalekite marauders and basically started wiping them out. Again, it was by the time that the army guys could turn around and get back to them, they'd already killed a bunch of people, taken a bunch of booty, and left. And so at this point, Moses goes in and people are grumbling at him like, hey, how come this just happened? I thought God was for us. And this is where they go into the tent, and Yahweh announces the extermination of all the Amalekites and says, Israel, I'm going to hand them over to you, and there will be peace with them because you are going to wipe out every single one of them that you come across. And turns out that they had a battle. Moses was able to keep his hands up the whole time. Joshua was his general on the ground fighting for him. And while he had his hands up, his brother and brother-in-law holding up his hands. They did great and ended up winning the battle. Turns out, though, that in what will become a recurring theme, they didn't kill all the Amalekites like God told them to. So the guys that were left over were a thorn in their side for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards. They were supposed to be erased from history, but even Jeremiah is there in Jeremiah 2, talking about how the Amalekites are still a thorn in the side of Israel. But after the success of the battle, they set up the altar to the Lord there, and it turns out there's a C-shaped rock right underneath this rock here. I just didn't take a picture of it. And they named it, they erected the altar there to the altar of Yahweh Nisi, the Lord is my banner. And so at this point, we're almost there. At this point, you're thinking, okay, great. So we escaped the Egyptians. We just saw the Pharaoh's army completely wiped out. Chariots gone. We escaped in a way that we didn't think we were going to. And then we spent 2 months rolling around the desert. It wasn't really that great, but we got to go to Mount Sinai. We saw some people killed because they wanted to worship a calf, but that's kind of cool anyway. And then we were able to get our guys together. We were able to set up the line of march. We were able to get everything set up. We have our radio. We're ready to take over the promised land. And they're like, I know. Let's send out some spies. God's like, really? Why need spies? I'll take where you go. Like, we're going to send out spies, so send out spies. And this is the one that you guys probably know the story too. 10 of the spies come back and like, you won't believe this. There's like giants everywhere, and there's no way we can take this place out. And Caleb and Joshua are like, not that big. We got the Lord on our side. Like, I think we got this. And so at this point, this is where we're going to battle for them. At this point, God's not pleased and says, because you guys did this and you're not trusting in me, I'm not going to hand them over to you right now. In fact, not a single one of you guys is going to see the promised land, except for my 2 faithful, Joshua and Caleb. And they're like, oh, okay, totally was joking on that. I'll tell you what, we'll go attack them just like you wanted to see. We'll go attack. And they go attack without God's blessing, but even more importantly for them in this case, they left behind the Ark of the Covenant. They're like, we're not even going to bring the Ark with us, right? We just want to go attack. So this is kind of a weird belief here, but you do not have to be a military strategist to understand this, I hope, but I'll kind of walk you through this. So here the Hebrews come up and they're like, oh, we're sorry, we're still going to attack these guys. And they come up here and they see that the Amalekites and the other guys, the Canaanites, came here out of the end. They're all lined up on these hills over there. If you remember Star Wars Episode 3, don't attack me, Anakin, I've got the high ground. They had high ground. The Hebrews attacked them anyway, and much like it happened to Anakin, turns out very quickly they started getting smoked because they're walking uphill with these kopeshes, and maybe they got the archers and their slingers there, but these guys are running downhill with armor and heavy spears. Again, you don't have to be a military genius to know that that's not exactly the way to fight it out. So the Israelites retreat. Not only do they retreat, but because these guys are coming downhill, they can flank them on both sides and go almost as fast running as they can go running, and the battle line of Israel gets basically wiped out at that point. They tried to disorient the enemy with their archers. The cavalry came behind them, smoked them from the back end, and the foot soldiers were at a huge disadvantage and lost. So they retreated back, and it turns out that it was going to take another 38 years before God even let them come close to retaking the Holy Land like they were supposed to do. Last thing is, if you don't believe God, He makes you go live in a place like that for 38 years. Anyway, so I've got about 11 minutes. I don't know if anybody has questions. I'm happy to answer them. I'm happy to take criticism. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I was interested in the part where you were explaining that the Hebrews were armed when they were heavy laborers for Pharaoh.
Yep.
So I'm kind of curious because you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, but you're only saying maybe a small percentage the mercenaries were armed.
Yeah. So if you think about it as a good way might think would be like if your great-great-grandfather grew up in the Wild West, right? And so even if you were a farmer out on a ranch in the middle of Montana, you'd had to know how to fight off the Indians, or maybe you'd been in the Civil War or something like that. So even if you're doing something that isn't like militaristic at the time, you've got that culture of, Second Amendment all the way, or whatever. So the difference of what a lot of people think of when they think of the Exodus story is that these guys were just, ditch diggers their whole life. They never picked up a sword, never picked up a spear, never picked up a sling, and somehow made it out and and did all these things militarily, wow, it must have been, awesome that God protected them that way. God is awesome, but I think what I'm trying to do with this is show that God was awesome in a tactically, strategically, and operationally relevant way that showed how a group of people who had been marauders, had been professionals, frankly. Again, if you take 100,000, you might have 5 or 10,000 that are the armed military type guys, just like we might find today. But they had the background. It wasn't just that 100,000 naked, starving people who've never picked up a sword in their life were going out into the desert. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I just find it interesting that Pharaoh would have let them have all these weapons while they were forced laborers.
Great question. So remember, they had been doing, if you read some of the Egyptian stories, they've been doing kind of the Pharaoh's dirty work for him for a while, right? They've been, if you want to call it like, if you take, I don't want to get into like politics, but if the people in Tampa are rioting, you don't really want to bring in Tampa City police to take care of that because they have to live with them the rest of their lives, right? So you might bring in guys from Atlanta or DC or Chicago or something like that to take care of them, or the National Guard or something. That was how the Egyptians were using the Habaru, the mercenaries, the marauders, as kind of their strong-arm guys, so that when they could go do the stuff that they didn't want the Egyptian army to do, or thought the Egyptian people might revolt against, that they would have these Habaru marauder, mercenary guys take care of that for them. So it wasn't necessarily like, why are you letting forced laborers, carry weapons? It was more these guys who had been doing this job for hundreds of years for us. I remember protecting all that northern route from the Hittites coming in, or the Canaanites coming in, or the guys from Mesopotamia coming in. They'd been kind of protecting their left flank for them for hundreds of years. It just so happened that the last Pharaoh had set them up so that they were going to be, and it wasn't even like it was like ditch diggers, so that was part of it. But think of them as like almost like Seabees would be. That's really messing with kind of how the Seabees do their job. But they're kind of militaristic guys who are now doing like construction stuff, but not for like a military purpose, but for like a purpose that they didn't want to do on building new temples for new gods that they didn't really believe in, or stuff that they just had guys die from in fighting battles to destroy those temples against the Egyptians. Now they're having to go back and rebuild them. And so that's where I think that don't look at them necessarily as like ditch diggers, but look at them as like people who are forced into doing a job that they just didn't want to do.
Was it kind of the case where they had, you call them mercenaries, but there was a comment in there that a Pharaoh came to the throne who did not know Joseph.
Yes.
The paradigm on what they were and what they represented changed.
Yes.
And they became fearful of them because of not only what they were capable of, but their numbers.
Exactly. Yes. Was our question with that, or?
Well, I'm saying was that when it all changed, where
That was absolutely part of it.
arrested and they were freelance mercenaries?
Yeah, and so mercenary might be too strong. The marauders came out of the book, and I say mercenaries, but it was not necessarily for cash, but for land, right? So you can live up here as long as you're protecting your left flank, as long as you're doing kind of our heavy lifting for our strong arm and stuff like that. And so when it became, this wasn't like the family and friends and whatever of Joseph, the guy who was like the grand vizier, number 2 behind the Pharaoh, but now it's like, dude, these riffraff marauder guys, like, why are we beholden to them? Why do they get to live on our land for free? Why are they doing these things? How come there's so many of them? How can we let them be armed? It was those types of things that were brought up in that.
So they're more irregulars for that flank?
So yeah, actually, if you know the term auxiliaries, right? So the Romans used a lot of auxiliaries when they did their thing. Think of them as like the Egyptian auxiliaries, right? They weren't formally integrated in the Egyptian military. There wasn't like the Israelite legion of the Egyptian army, but they were up there as auxiliaries for doing the work up there in the northeast sector. Yes, sir.
So is this like the beginning and the end as Egypt as a world power, or is it already pretty much on the way out?
So no, interesting enough. Egypt, it's kind of funny, as I was doing some of the research for this, I had kind of walked into this thinking that Egyptian history, that they can account for basically every pharaoh of the last 3,000 years, and every timelines all lined up, and we have huge records, and all these things. And it turns out that's not the case. And so one of the fascinating things to me is that there are, I'm forgetting what the word is now, but there are places where you can see like, oh, this document talks about both this guy from Babylon and this guy from Egypt. I know when the Babylon guy was there, some of the Egypt guy was there at that same time. Or in the 4th year of this, there was this eclipse. Like, okay, well I can count back when the eclipse was, and so that was the 4th year of, Jehoshaphat's reign. So Jehoshaphat must have been from here to here and set it up. Egypt actually has 3 floating balls of that time frame, right? So we know that like when this king over here was doing his thing and the Egyptians had this set up here and the pyramid was built in the 17th year of his reign. Cool, but I don't know when that started. That might have started in 2800 BC, it might have started in 2200 BC. No one really knows. And there's 3 parts of this Egyptian thing. So this was basically the end of the kind of middle kingdom, the 18th, 19th, 20th dynasties. And then going forward, you see a lot of stuff that happened in Sumeria and Sumeria in like the 700s when Israel and Sumeria were just getting crushed. Judah and Sumeria were just getting crushed. It was the Egyptians were part of this. They were back to being strong again and things like that. So one of the interesting things, and I told you I wasn't going to do apologetics, so I'm sorry. One of the very interesting things is that if you read the Exodus story, and you think that the Egyptians went through these 10 plagues, and they lost most of their army and their king all at one time, and all that, you would think these dudes would have been like crushed for a while, right? Like imagine just the United States, as great as we are right now, if we lost our president and half our army, and we had a whole bunch of our commerce taken away, and all these plagues, and COVID, and blah, 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 all at once. Like, we're the greatest place on earth right now, but we're going to be hurting after a while. There wasn't anything said in the Egyptian annals about how Egypt was crushed for a period of, 50 years, 100 years, whatever. So basically there's a lot of study going on right now to try to find out, like, where was a place where you had a guy that was pharaoh for a long time, and then like a guy who was a pharaoh for like 1 year, and then we didn't hear about him anymore. And so that's where they're trying to kind of piece those things together, and you'll hear the low chronology, the high chronology, the early period, the Mesopotamian method, all these types of things. And I think it's a way for people to, no offense to PhDs, people will go try to get a PhD by being cool and interesting in some new way of counting up Bible stories. It's just not my bag. Sorry. Maybe later, if Sarah lets me go to seminary. Yes, please.
I'm going to add something interesting. There's a 1st century oral tradition around Moses being an Egyptian military commander as part of his upbringing now. It's a very late oral tradition with the Judaism from Josephus, but I can also explain some of his ability to sort of meet people.
No, there's absolutely a thing to that, and I didn't bring it up, I didn't go through sources in this, but Josephus does a bunch of stuff about the Exodus, and he has a bunch of stuff about a lot of things, he wrote the Antiquities, right? But you're right, he has a lot of things that Josephus took a kind of scholarly view on things, but tried to assign as little supernatural as possible to them, right? So it wasn't that God through miracles led his people through there. It was more like some of the atheistic scholarship on it is Moses was a great commander. They just were able to commence a night crossing of water with 100,000 people, and it would have been great. And, those guys, that was a great commander. Good job, Moses. You must learn from the Pharaoh. Or like God was kind of one of the two. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, getting back to Egypt again, so they just keep on existing, the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, but they just kept on doing their own thing, they were left alone.
They were not left alone, so if you go back, we got kind of doing that. So now we're starting to my danger zone, right? So Egypt, for the longest time, if you can picture it, out here you've got like a strip along the coast that is now like North Tunisia, Algeria, even out to Morocco, that even today is relatively settled, it's green, lush, whatever. It doesn't extend very far. I mean, it's like miles from the coastline, not like hundreds of miles, right? So all this right here is just like desert. They didn't have to worry much about Along the Nile Valley would flood every once in a while. They couldn't set up like, big towers in the middle and stuff. So there was always kind of a fear of, the Cushites, they think might have been from like Nubia down here in the south. And so Egypt was really focused on, because they've been wiped out twice at least by people coming in from the south. So they kind of have their west flank taken care of by the desert and a little bit of stuff here. Again, I think that's one of the reasons that the militaristic aspect of the Israelites would help them out. Because they had a buffer up here where they didn't have to waste time worrying about who was going to invade from the northeast. They had the Israelites up there to help them take care of it. And they just had to kind of focus on the south, right? So throughout most of antiquity, Egypt really was worried about what was coming up from the south. After Alexander, the Ptolemaic dynasty came in, and that was kind of the end of the kind of classical Kushite, Egyptian, King Tut, Ramses, Nefertiti, those types. And you got Ptolemy and his guys, which ended up with Cleopatra, and that's when the kingdom ended, in Roman times. But Caesarea and Alexandria were major cities in the world up until the 500s AD. Yes, sir.
Going back to like the Abraham, Palestine kind of stuff, and what you said about like the Abraham for the Israelites, one of the surprising parts of that story for me is always, wait, I thought these guys were just like agro farmers. How did these guys have?
They were agro.
The tactical means, should we also kind of apply some of that to even those guys? And these think of them more as marauders than cavalry.
Yeah, so if you go back to again, this is more of like the roughly 2000 BC, so hundreds of years before even like, the Exodus times, right?
Right.
So, Hammurabi and the guys who fought in that area from Mesopotamia, again, they were used to having large armies. They had a specialized warrior class. Part of the thing, almost like with the feudal knights in the Middle Ages, like if you're bored because you're like the second son, you're not going to be a king. So now what do you do? And they didn't really have a priesthood necessarily to go into. So they would just stand up professional armies, and they would just go out, and when they got bored, they would go try to take over something. That's why, the Canaanites were almost always, out of luck because they couldn't, and they did every once in a while go through like what is now Iran and Afghanistan over to like the Indian area and things like that. And there's a lot of trade going back and forth there, and they pushed out that way sometimes. We don't necessarily get a lot of those stories passed down through Western civilization, but in the East, it's pretty well known that the Babylonians and those types of guys went east just as much as the west. But the guys down here, they were very much like they called them kings, but you might be a king of like a city of like 500 people, right? So it wasn't like you're the king of England, you have 30,000 people, behind your flag, you have the battle or whatever. It's, hey, these guys are coming all down. And again, it's more like Braveheart, like, hey, we've got plans, we've got 1,000 of us here. Don't hurt us, we'll surrender, and so that's sort of something like that. But that's not to say we'll go into it next week when we start talking about how Joshua and the guys like actually took over the promised land. There's some really, really interesting strategies and tactics that go into how the Israelites fought versus how the kings of these areas were fighting, and that's the teaser.